When it comes to video games, Star Wars fans haven't had much to celebrate over the past 10 years. Sure, there were the Battlefront games, but the first delivered an underwhelming multiplayer-only experience, and the second featured one of the worst monetization schemes of this generation. And then there was Star Wars 1313, a single-player-focused game that sounded all but perfect but was eventually cancelled when Electronic Arts shuttered the studio behind its troubled development. But thankfully, on November 15th of this year, Star Wars fans might finally get the game they deserve. Star Wars Jedi: Fallen Order is a third-person exploration-focused action game that might have somehow avoided the influence of the dark side. Developed by Respawn Entertainment, the same studio behind the Titanfall games and Apex Legends, Fallen Order is a departure for the studio. Not only does it take inspiration from Metroid Prime and other modern gaming masterpieces, it looks to feature solid mechanics and a rich, authentic world. And it looks to do all this without any microtransactions or unnecessary multiplayer or online modes. If that sounds like something you're excited for, I hope you'll join me as I take a look at everything we know about the world and the gameplay of Star Wars Jedi: Fallen Order. In Fallen Order, you play a Jedi Padawan named Cal Kestis. Cal is one of the few Jedi who survived Order 66, an act of genocide enacted by the Empire in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, to extinguish the galaxy of Jedi. As such, Fallen Order takes place after the events of Episode 3, but before the events of Episode 4, A New Hope. To evade the Empire, Cal stopped his training to take refuge on planet Bracca, but an unfortunate turn of events led him to use his Force abilities in public, outing him as a Jedi. The Empire quickly learns of Cal's whereabouts, and it's then that he meets a Jedi Knight named Cere Junda who agrees to help Cal finish his training in exchange for his help restoring the now crippled Jedi Order. Cere also introduces you to a short and scrappy alien named Grease, who captains the Mantis Stinger, a small starship that becomes your mode of interstellar travel and acts as something of a safe house throughout the game. As you hop from planet to planet, you'll have one of the Empire's most fearsome Jedi hunters on your trail. Her name is the Second Sister, and she's an Inquisitor, a specialized and powerful class of Imperial soldier groomed specifically to hunt and kill Jedi. So those are the broad strokes, but more specifically, we know that the early game takes you to planet Kashyyyk to track down and rescue Tarful, an elusive yet influential Wookiee freedom fighter imprisoned by the Empire. Everything we saw in the 30-minute gameplay demo takes place during this story beat, and it's here that you meet Saw Gerrera, a rebel fighter who first appeared in the Star Wars Rebels and Clone Wars animated series. Gerrera was later played by Forrest Whitaker in Rogue One, and it was a nice surprise to see that Whitaker is reprising his role in Fallen Order. When Gerrera meets Cal, he's skeptical that Cal is a Jedi, but he soon changes his mind, and the two become allies. As for other main characters in Fallen Order, there's one who I haven't yet mentioned, and despite being small in stature, he actually plays one of the most important roles in the entire game. His name is BD-1, and he's the droid that will act as Cal's ever-present sidekick throughout the game. Similar to R2-D2 and BB-8, BD-1 looks to add some levity to the story, and more importantly, he'll help solve puzzles and navigate the game's different environments, but more on that later. For now, let's look at part of the game that's far less material. If there's one common thread that runs through every Star Wars story, whether it's a book, a movie, or a video game, it's the Force. So it's fitting that the Force affects every aspect of gameplay in Jedi: Fallen Order. From what I can tell, we got to see 6 Force abilities in Respawn's 30-minute gameplay demo, the first of which is a pretty basic wall run that allows you to sprint along vertical surfaces and even hop from wall to wall. Only walls marked by specific textures, such as these metal panels, will allow for this maneuver, so you'll know exactly what to look for when you spot an area or platform that might be just out of reach. The second Force ability, one that's also designed to help with traversal, is the Force Flip. This is essentially a double jump, allowing you to quickly leap to higher platforms, jump across wider chasms, and even execute aerial attacks. Next up are three abilities that are also handy for traversing the world, but are also necessary for succeeding in combat. First up is Force Push. This is nothing new to the Star Wars universe, and it basically lets you push someone or something out of your way by simply extending your arm. Conversely, Force Pull does the exact opposite. You constrict enemies and objects from a distance, then pull them towards you. Next is a new ability called Force Slow. While this is similar to Kylo Ren's ability to freeze objects in time, Cal's ability is different in that he can't stop things entirely, only slow them down. If you're wondering how Force Push, Force Pull, and Force Slow all work together in battle, fear not. I've got a whole section on combat near the end of this video. The last Force ability we got to see, and one that seems to have been overlooked by much of the press coverage of Fallen Order, is a skill that appears to be called Sense Echo. Seen here, it looks like Cal can examine elements of his environment to listen to events from the past and learn about what happened in certain areas.
Patrol the base. Got another breach down here, some kind of webbing. Hey, who's that?
So those are the Force abilities we've seen so far, and had you asked me right after Respawn first showed the demo, I would have guessed that more abilities would unlock later in the game. However, when asked in an interview with Game Informer whether to expect new abilities we haven't yet seen, Stig Asmussen, game director for Jedi Fallen Order, was reluctant to confirm whether this was the case. Quote, "I don't want to give away any spoilers," he said. "What I will say is Cal, his Force abilities that we've seen at the show that we shared at E3, everything about them is going to grow as he evolves into a Jedi, or as he evolves as a Jedi." End quote. So it sounds like the actual number of distinct Force abilities you acquire throughout the game might be relatively limited. On the flip side, it sounds like the number of things you can actually do with those abilities, whether in combat or as you explore, will grow throughout the game. As for the system by which you might actually acquire and upgrade these abilities, we got a teeny glimpse in the gameplay demo. When you encounter a save point, you can meditate to regenerate health and access the game's skill tree to distribute ability points, which I believe you can earn through gaining experience in combat and even discover in chests throughout the world. We haven't gotten a definitive look at the skill tree, but this screenshot clearly shows the option to access it here. In Game Informer's feature article on Fallen Order, executive editor Andrew Reiner described it as a, quote, "sea of interlinked circles." So this is likely that. In any case, your abilities will evolve as you get deeper into the game. This aligns perfectly with Cal's story arc as a Jedi completing his training, and it also lends itself to Fallen Order's style of progression, which to the surprise and delight of many was revealed to be inspired by none other than Metroid Prime, one of the greatest 3D adventures ever made. Let's take a look. As I mentioned before, your ever-present companion in Fallen Order is a droid by the name of BD-1. BD, which stands for Buddy Droid, will help you navigate and even traverse the game's environments in a number of ways. First, he has a holographic projector which he uses to display the world map. Anytime you want to survey your surroundings or just figure out where to go next, he'll display the map in real time, meaning the game doesn't pause and enemies can still attack you. But if you're in the clear, you can take your time as you rotate and adjust the map in full, glorious 3D. Anybody who's played the Metroid Prime games will instantly recognize their influence here, and Jeff Majors, lead level designer on Fallen Order, was quick to acknowledge this influence in an interview with Game Informer. Quote, "Metroid has absolutely served as an inspiration for us," he said. "I think what the Metroid style of level design does for us, it's somewhat a way to give the player guided exploration." End quote. However, in a separate interview, Asmussen made it clear that Fallen Order is more than just a Metroid clone. Quote, "I think Jedi Fallen Order's approach will feel fresh. It's not exactly Metroidvania. We also looked at games like Bloodborne and Dark Souls that have the same types of methodology. We studied those games and they inspired us to find an experience that works well for our game." End quote. I'll get to some of the Dark Souls and Bloodborne influences later, but to Asmundsen's credit, there are ways that Fallen Order does its own thing. For example, unlike so many games that hold your hand from destination to destination, here the game never places a waypoint on your map, leaving you, the player, to deduce where you need to go next. Granted, the developers have said that BD1 will occasionally hop off your shoulder and lead you in the right direction, but for the most part, Respawn wants you to fully explore the world, and this is one way they're encouraging you to do just that. And if that sounds intimidating, worry not. The Metroidvania style of discovery has other ways of helping you along. As you encounter doors and blockades you can't yet open, they'll be marked in red on your map. As you discover new abilities and unlock them, they turn green. This gives you a great way to locate secrets you might have passed over and keep track of entire areas you have yet to explore. As such, the level design will frequently require you to explore environments in a non-linear fashion. We saw this in the demo when Cal encountered a gigantic piece of machinery that required additional power to operate. So he and BD1 turned around, explored a new area, and eventually discovered an ability called Overcharge that enabled BD1 to activate the machine. This was a big relief for me because it means that not only will you be able to upgrade Cal's force powers, which may be limited in number, you'll also be able to expand BD1's skill set at workbenches scattered throughout each level. That said, while BD will unlock doors and help solve certain environmental puzzles, it's your force abilities, at least from what we've seen thus far, that will help with the more dangerous and acrobatic traversal. As mentioned before, there's your wall run and your force jump, but you'll also be able to use your force pull to grab out of reach vines, or use force push to break through damaged walls or topple pieces of your environment to create footbridges. But perhaps most useful is force slow. We've seen multiple instances where Cal has slowed giant fan blades, which he then passed through, or giant turbines, which he then walked across. My hope is that Respawn has thought of plenty of other ways these abilities can help you explore your environment and access previously out-of-reach areas. Adding another layer to the exploration is the fact that the game will be spread across multiple planets, each with their own recognizable look, not to mention their own distinct puzzles, upgrades, enemies, and bosses. You'll travel to these planets via the Stinger Mantis, and other than Kashyyyk and Bracca, we don't know how many planets we'll get to visit, but the game's official website does say that you'll, quote, explore ancient forests, windswept cliffs, and haunted jungles. And that you'll, quote, explore the mysteries of a long-extinct civilization in hopes of rebuilding the Jedi Order. In that Fallen Order's prequel comic series, Dark Temple, visits the jungle planet of Ontotho, this might be one of the additional planets you'll visit along your journey. Of course, that's speculation on my part, but one thing we know for sure is that according to Respawn, roughly half the planets you'll visit will be locations we'll have already seen within the Star Wars universe, while the other half will be entirely new. Pretty exciting. And speaking of the game's size, Respawn have also said that the 30 minutes it took to play the demo takes up roughly 15 to 20% of the time it'll take to play through Kashyyyk from start to finish. That means that one planet will take at least 2.5 hours to complete. Say there are 6 planets in total, that would take a bare minimum of 15 hours. And that's without backtracking, and there will be backtracking. You'll not only be free to revisit any planet anytime, you'll actually have to once you gain new abilities if you want to explore every corner of the world. And players who do will be rewarded with plenty of chests containing treasures in the form of not just ability points, but also upgrades that can extend Cal's force and health meters, as well as cosmetic items to customize the look of your lightsaber, BD1, and even the Stinger Mantis. One last bit of exploration-based gameplay involves BD1's ability to scan certain parts of your environment. Scanning objects and enemies will add data entries to an encyclopedia about the game's worlds, and the developers have said that they're looking into some sort of reward system for players who want to uncover the game's info and lore. That said, this is optional, but what is decidedly not optional is fighting the many enemies within the game. So let's talk about what it's like to break out your lightsaber and do battle. In designing the combat for Fallen Order, Respawn set out to create what Asmussen calls thoughtful combat. This means the game discourages mindless button mashing and repetitive combos in favor of deliberate attacks and precise dodges, blocks, and parries. Plus, your strategies will have to change depending on which enemy you're fighting. Think Dark Souls or Bloodborne minus the punishing difficulty. I want to reiterate that. This game will not be as hard as those games, or even close. For example, you'll be able to destroy your most basic enemies with just one well-timed swipe of your lightsaber, the mechanics of which work like this. You can execute a basic swing by tapping the light attack button, or a more powerful swing by pressing the heavy attack button. And by holding down heavy attack, you'll use the force to perform a powerful dash attack. But of course, not every enemy in Fallen Order can be killed in one hit. In order to keep combat fun and interesting, Respawn gave many enemies weapons that can actually block a lightsaber. When facing these opponents, Cal will have to whittle down their block meter, which is displayed right below their health. When this meter depletes, it's then that they become vulnerable to fatal lightsaber attacks. And blocking goes both ways. Cal also has a block meter, and just like the bad guys, when it depletes, you become vulnerable. In other words, spamming the block button will eventually get you killed. But if you time your block just right, you can parry an attack. This will briefly open up your enemy to a one-hit fatal blow, which when timed correctly, will trigger an awesome animation that ends the life of whatever enemy you're facing. One additional blocking maneuver you'll have is the classic blaster deflection, which is handy for taking out enemies on out-of-reach platforms. But if blocking, deflecting, and parrying aren't your style, you can press the dodge button to sidestep an attack. Or if you want to get even further out of harm's way, double tapping the dodge button will perform a roll maneuver that will create even more distance between you and your assailant. This will be especially useful when your enemies flash red, which indicates that they're about to perform a more powerful and unblockable attack. When you eventually do get hit, you can replenish your health meter by using a health canister. The number of canisters in your inventory is indicated just to the left of your health meter, and with the press of a button, BD1 will toss one for you to grab straight out of the air. This animation is super slick, and it works both in and out of combat. As for how many health canisters you can carry, we don't know the maximum, but we do know that you start the game with 2, and you'll find more strewn across the map. The one remaining meter on the combat HUD is the force meter, which depletes as you use your force abilities in combat. While this does mean that your force reserves are limited, the good news is that the team at Respawn have implemented some genuinely awesome ways to devastate your opponents. First up is a nifty technique we saw in the demo, whereby simultaneously pressing heavy attack and block, Cal uses his lightsaber as a boomerang, not unlike Kratos' axe in God of War. The rest of Cal's force-powered combat tricks involve abilities I've already talked about, but stick with me because this is where things get good. For starters, Cal can use force slow on his opponents. Doing this with a quick button tap will slow them for a short time, but if you hold the input button long enough, Cal will lock them in a near frozen state for between 5 and 10 seconds. If you're facing off against multiple foes, you can freeze one while you take out the others. Even cooler is that force slow can be used to slow blaster shots mid-air. You can then use force pull to grab the trooper who fired the shot and drop him in the path of his own fire. Now that's just mean. As for force push, you can use it to shove enemies out of the way or into other enemies, but it also has uses beyond the obvious. If you run into troopers armed with flamethrowers, you can shove them into a wall, which will rupture the fuel tank on their back. After a few seconds, the tank will explode, damaging them and any enemies nearby. Another nifty tactic was mentioned by Fallen Order's lead combat designer, Jason De Haras, in yet another interview with Game Informer. When you encounter these explosive creatures called flame beetles, you can use force pull to grab one out of midair, then use force push to throw it toward an enemy, causing it to explode on impact. Awesome. It's clear that the developers had a lot of fun thinking of different ways to use the force against your opponents, but again, you'll have to keep an eye on your force meter. And another deterrent from mindlessly spamming the force is that some stronger enemies have clever ways to resist your force-based attacks, and even turn them against you. For example, Purge Troopers are highly trained soldiers that can resist your force pull by digging their staff into the ground. They can then lean into your pull and transfer their momentum into a powerful attack. As for enemies that are even more powerful than Purge Troopers, we know that different planets in the game will feature unique boss and mini-boss battles. While we haven't seen any proper boss fights, we know that the Second Sister is a likely boss, and the developers have indicated that the game will feature other powerful villains within the Star Wars universe. Given the time frame of the story, there's even been speculation that Darth Vader might make an appearance, but the developers have remained silent. Fingers crossed. Some cool sequences we have seen include Cal fighting an AT-ST against which you'll use the Force to send back rockets and projectiles. And we got to see Cal wreak havoc from within the cockpit of an AT-AT, and thankfully, Respawn have said that Fallen Order will feature other one-off gameplay segments to mix things up throughout the campaign. Getting back to the melee combat, I haven't even touched on the indigenous life forms you'll encounter on each planet. Okay, so I did mention the flame beetles, but the game will of course feature plenty of other aliens, such as these giant arachnids, which have their own unique attacks. And sometimes the aliens in Fallen Order might actually do you a favor. When Imperial troopers mix with the local wildlife, they'll often have to defend themselves. When this happens, you can sit back and watch to see who wins, then jump in and finish the job. Before I wrap things up, remember how I said that Fallen Order took other inspirations from Dark Souls and Bloodborne? The mechanic where that influence is most obvious lies within the game's save points, which act a lot like campfires in Dark Souls. Whenever you visit a save point, all the enemies in that area will respawn and your health canisters will restock. And while I don't anticipate Fallen Order to be an overly grindy game, this will come in handy if you want to revisit a wave of enemies to gain experience and fill out your skill tree. Again, Respawn has made it perfectly clear that Fallen Order won't be even close to as punishing as Dark Souls, and they've said that the exploration won't be a direct copy of the Metroid Prime series. But it does seem like the team is taking all the right bits from some of the most beloved action adventures of all time. The result could be one of the best Star Wars games in years, and I say that knowing full well that EA is publishing the game. We'll know how things turn out when Fallen Order releases on November 15th, but if you want to learn even more about the game, you'll find all the articles and videos I used to research this preview in the description below. As always, if you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up, and if you want to see what I'm playing or keep up with hidden gems that I find, follow me on Twitter and Instagram. And if you never want to miss any of my videos, all it takes is clicking that subscribe button. Until soon, we'll see you next time.